was just after 9 on a cool October evening in Norfolk, Virginia. The kind of night where streetlights cast long shadows and the air smells faintly of salt from the nearby harbor. Most folks were already inside, cooking dinner, watching TV, or tucking kids into bed. But one woman was still out, walking home alone. She'd just finished a long shift at the Naval Hospital, where she worked as a trauma specialist. Her feet ached, her shoulders were tight, and all she wanted was a hot shower and maybe a cup of tea. She wore a dark hoodie, jeans, and worn-in sneakers. Nothing flashy, nothing that drew attention. Just a regular person heading home after a hard day's work. But sometimes, just being who you are is enough to draw the wrong kind of attention. As she turned down a quieter side street, the kind lined with old brick buildings and flickering lampposts, she noticed 3 figures leaning near a boarded-up storefront. They were young, maybe early 20s, and dressed in baggy clothes with hoodies pulled low. At first, she didn't think much of it. People hang out on corners everywhere. But then one of them stepped into the middle of the sidewalk, blocking her path. "Hey," he said, voice sharp. "Where you think you're going?" She slowed but didn't stop walking. "Just heading home," she replied, calm, eyes steady. The other 2 joined him, forming a loose half-circle. One of them let out a low laugh. "You live around here?" "Don't look like you belong." She kept her voice even. "I've lived here for years." That's when the slurs started. Ugly words thrown like stones. Words meant to hurt, to humiliate, to remind her that in their eyes, she didn't deserve to walk these streets, didn't deserve to exist in peace just because of the color of her skin. Her stomach tightened, but her breathing stayed slow. Years of training kicked in, not the kind you learn in a classroom, but the kind forged in high-stress environments where one wrong move could cost you everything. She'd served overseas, not as a frontline combatant in the way movies show, but in a role just as critical, embedded with elite naval units providing medical support under fire, trained in survival, evasion, and close-quarters defense. She wasn't a Navy SEAL, because as of now, women still aren't allowed in that specific program. But she'd trained alongside them, learned from them, and earned their respect. And that training? It never really leaves you. Still, she didn't want trouble. She held up her hands slightly, palms out, a universal sign of peace. "I don't want any problems," she said. "I'm just trying to get home." One of the guys stepped closer, his breath smelling of cheap beer. "Then hand over your phone and your wallet. Make it easy." She didn't move. No. That no seemed to surprise them. They expected fear, maybe tears, maybe begging. Not quiet refusal. The one with the beer breath shoved her hard. She stumbled back, her shoulder hitting the rough brick wall of a building. Pain shot through her arm, but she didn't cry out. Instead, she locked eyes with him. Not with anger, but with something colder. Assessment. She was reading them like a battlefield, gauging their balance, their coordination, their confidence. These weren't trained fighters. They were bullies, fueled by hate and bravado, not skill. One of them pulled a knife, a cheap folding blade, the kind sold at gas stations. He flicked it open with a metallic snap that echoed in the narrow street. "Last chance," he sneered. She exhaled slowly. Part of her wanted to run. But running might trigger a chase. And if they caught her from behind, that would be worse. So she stayed put, heart pounding but mind clear. "I serve this country," she said, voice low but firm. "I've bled for people who didn't even know my name." "Don't make me hurt you," they laughed. Actually laughed. One of them mocked her in a high-pitched voice. "Oh no, she's gonna hurt us." That's when she knew talking was over. The knife wielder lunged, not with precision but with wild aggression. He swung the blade toward her arm, probably just trying to scare her. But in her world, a blade is never just a threat. It's a promise. Her body moved before her brain finished the thought. She sidestepped, letting his momentum carry him forward. At the same time, her left hand shot out, gripping his wrist just above the knife. Her right hand struck the pressure point on his inner elbow, sharp, precise. His arm went numb. The knife clattered to the pavement. Before he could react, she twisted his wrist down and across his body, using his own weight to drive him face first into the sidewalk. He grunted, stunned. The other 2 froze for half a second, just long enough. The bigger one charged next, swinging a wild punch. She ducked under it, stepped inside his reach, and drove the heel of her palm upward into his nose. Not hard enough to break it, just enough to shock his system, blur his vision, drop his guard. He staggered back, hands flying to his face. The third guy hesitated. That was his mistake. She didn't attack him. She just stood tall, breathing steady, eyes locked on his. "Walk away," she said. Now, but pride got in his way. He pulled a chain from his pocket, probably meant as a weapon, maybe just for show, and swung it at her head. She caught it midair with one hand, yanked it hard, and used his surprise to pull him off balance. As he stumbled forward, she swept his legs with a clean textbook takedown. He hit the ground hard, the wind knocked out of him. It was over in less than 20 seconds. All three were on the ground, groaning, dazed, disarmed. None seriously hurt, but all thoroughly neutralized. She stepped back, chest rising and falling, scanning the street. No witnesses, no cameras she could see. Just the hum of distant traffic and the sound of her own heartbeat in her ears. She didn't gloat, didn't curse, didn't even look at them with hatred. Just disappointment. Disappointment that in 2025, in a city full of sailors, Marines, and veterans from every background, someone could still be attacked just for existing while black. She picked up the knife with 2 fingers, careful not to smudge prints, and placed it on the sidewalk near the one who'd held it. Then she pulled out her phone. Her hands didn't shake as she dialed 911. "Yeah," she said when the dispatcher answered. "I need police. I've been assaulted. 3 males armed with a knife and a chain. They're down but not unconscious. I'm at the corner of Bainbridge and 14th. I'm a witness and a victim." She gave her name, her address, her military ID number, just in case. Then she sat on the curb, a few safe feet away from the groaning men, and waited. She didn't look at them. She looked up at the sky instead, at the few stars visible through the city lights. She thought about her grandmother, who'd marched for civil rights in the 60s. Thought about the young medics she'd trained overseas, some of them barely older than these boys. Thought about how tired she was, not just from the fight, but from the weight of always having to be ready, always having to prove she belonged. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder. She took a deep breath. The night wasn't over. There'd be questions, statements, maybe even doubt, but she'd done what she had to do. Not as a soldier, not as a symbol, just as a human being who refused to be broken. And as the red and blue lights finally rounded the corner, painting the brick walls in flashes of urgency, she stood up slowly, brushed off her jeans, and prepared to tell her truth calmly, clearly, and without apology. The police arrived fast, 2 cruisers, lights spinning, tires crunching on the cracked pavement. Officers stepped out, hands near their belts but not drawing weapons yet. They took in the scene. 1 woman standing calmly by the curb, 3 young men scattered on the ground, one holding his nose, another rubbing his wrist, the third still trying to catch his breath. A knife lay on the sidewalk like a piece of dropped trash. An officer approached her first, voice measured. "Ma'am, are you hurt?" She shook her head. "Not seriously. Bruised shoulder, that's all." He nodded, then turned to his partner. "Secure the suspects. Check for weapons." As the officers moved in, she stayed where she was, hands visible, posture relaxed but alert. She knew how this could go. One wrong move, one misunderstood gesture, and the story could twist in a heartbeat. So she spoke only when spoken to, answered clearly, and never raised her voice. At the station, things slowed down. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The air smelled like stale coffee and old paper. She sat in a small interview room, sipping water from a paper cup while a detective reviewed her statement. "You said they called you racial slurs before attacking you?" he asked, pen hovering over his notepad. "Yes," she said, repeatedly. "They told me I didn't belong in the neighborhood. Said I should go back where I came from, even though I was born 10 miles from here." He wrote that down. Then came the harder part. "One of them claims you jumped them first, said you disarmed him and started throwing punches out of nowhere." She didn't flinch. Of course he'd say that. He got humiliated by a woman he thought was easy prey. But there's a knife on the scene. Body cam footage from your officers shows them on the ground when you arrived. And I've got bruises on my shoulder from being shoved into a wall, before I even raised a hand. The detective studied her. She wasn't angry, not defensive, just steady, like someone used to being doubted and still choosing truth over drama. He leaned back. "You mentioned military service. What branch?" "Navy," she said. "Special warfare support. 10 years active duty, 2 overseas deployments, medically separated after an IED incident. Not combat-related, but it left me with nerve damage in my left leg. Still, I kept up my training. You don't forget how to protect yourself when you've spent years learning how to keep others alive under fire. He nodded slowly. We'll verify your service record with NCIS, standard procedure. I expect nothing less, she replied. While they processed her statement, the 3 attackers were booked in the next room. They were loud at first, yelling, blaming each other, cursing her name. But as the reality set in, handcuffs, mugshots, charges, their bravado faded. One started crying. Another kept muttering. She moved like a ghost. Back in the interview room, the detective returned with a folder. Your record checks out, he said. You're listed as a former trauma specialist with advanced tactical medical training. Trained in combative, SEER, and non-lethal defense protocols. She gave a small nod. I never wanted to use any of that on civilians. Especially not on kids. Kids? He asked. They're young, she said quietly. Angry, misled, maybe even scared themselves, but still dangerous. Hate makes people stupid. And stupid gets people killed. The detective paused. You could have seriously hurt them. From what the officers described, you had full control within seconds. You chose not to escalate. I chose to survive, she corrected. There's a difference. Later that night, after giving a full statement and having her injuries photographed, she was finally allowed to go home. An officer offered to drive her, but she declined. I need to walk, she said. Just a few blocks. I need to feel like I still can. He understood. Didn't argue. Just walked her to the door and watched until she turned the corner. But the story didn't end there. By morning, grainy security footage from a nearby bodega started circulating online. It showed the start of the confrontation, the shoving, the slurs, the knife being pulled. Someone had posted it with the caption, "They attacked her just for walking home." Then a local news station picked it up. Not with sensational headlines, but with a quiet, respectful tone. They interviewed neighbors who described her as kind, quiet, always helping with community cleanups or walking elderly residents to the bus stop. No one was surprised she fought back, but many were shocked anyone would target her in the first place. Still, not everyone believed her. Online, the usual voices appeared. She's lying. She's exaggerating. Why didn't she just give them her phone? One comment read, if she was really trained, she wouldn't have needed to fight. Real soldiers avoid conflict, she saw those comments. She didn't respond. But they stung. Not because they hurt her pride, but because they missed the point entirely. Avoiding conflict isn't always possible when hate is staring you in the face with a blade. And sometimes survival is the most disciplined choice you can make. A few days later, she returned to work at the hospital. Her coworkers didn't treat her like a hero or a victim. They just asked if she was okay. She said she was. And in many ways she was. Her body healed fast. Her mind? That took longer. She started noticing things she hadn't before. How clerks at stores watched her a little too closely. How some people crossed the street when she approached. How even well-meaning friends would say, "You're so strong," as if strength was the only thing she had to offer. But she also noticed something else. Other women, especially women of color, started stopping her in the hallway, in the grocery store, at the bus stop, not to gawk, to thank her. I saw what happened, one said, eyes glistening. It made me feel less alone. Another whispered, my daughter's scared to walk to school now. Seeing you, it gave me hope. That meant more than any headline. Meanwhile, the legal process moved slowly, as it always does. The district attorney's office reviewed the evidence, the footage, the knife, her clean record, the officer's reports, and most importantly, the fact that none of the attackers had visible defensive wounds. If she'd been the aggressor, they'd have marks on their arms or hands from trying to block her strikes. But they didn't. Their injuries were consistent with being taken down quickly and efficiently by someone who knew exactly where to hit and where not to. Still, the gang members stuck to their story. They claimed she came at them out of nowhere, that the slurs were just jokes, that the knife wasn't even open. But their stories didn't match. One said she punched first. Another said she kicked. The third kept changing his timeline. The detective handling the case told her, they're scared. And when racists get scared, they double down. She understood. Fear breeds more fear, and hate is often just fear wearing a mask. One afternoon, while waiting for a follow-up meeting with the DA, she sat in a small park near the courthouse. An old man feeding pigeons nodded at her. "You're the one from the news, aren't you?" She didn't deny it. "I guess so." He tossed a handful of seeds. "My grandson's about the same age as those boys. I keep telling him, hate's a poison you drink hoping the other person dies. But it just eats you from the inside." She smiled faintly. "Wish more people knew that." "They will," he said. "When folks see someone like you, calm, honest, not looking for revenge, they start to question what they've been taught." She left the park feeling lighter. Not because the fight was behind her, but because she realized her role wasn't just to defend herself that night. It was to show what dignity looks like in the face of cruelty. Back home, she dug out an old duffel bag from her closet. Inside were her service medals, a folded unit patch, and a worn training manual on de-escalation and civilian self-defense. She'd kept it all tucked away, not out of shame, but because she'd hoped she'd never need that part of her life again. Now she wasn't so sure. She called a friend who ran a community center. "What if we offered free self-defense classes?" she asked. "Not just fighting, awareness, boundary setting, how to use your voice before your hands, especially for women who feel unsafe just walking to the bus stop." Her friend lit up. "We've wanted to do that for years. But we never had someone with real experience, someone who understands both strength and restraint." "I'm not a superhero," she said. "I'm just someone who got tired of pretending the world is safe when it's not." The first class was scheduled for the following month. She didn't plan to talk about the attack, but she would teach people how to stand tall, how to trust their instincts, and how to protect themselves without losing their humanity. Because that night in the alley wasn't about proving she could win a fight. It was about refusing to let fear, or hate, steal her right to exist peacefully in her own neighborhood. And as she sat at her kitchen table, sketching out lesson plans, she realized something. The real battle wasn't in that alley. It was in every quiet moment afterward, choosing compassion over bitterness, action over silence, and hope over despair. The attackers thought they were putting her in her place. Instead, they reminded her of her purpose, and that was something they could never take away. The courtroom wasn't like it is on TV. No dramatic music, no sudden outbursts, no lawyers slamming desks. It was quiet, almost too quiet. Just the hum of the air conditioner, the scratch of pens on notepads, and the occasional cough from the gallery. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting long rectangles of light across the worn wooden floor. It felt more like a library than a place where lives could change in a single afternoon. She sat at the small table beside the prosecutor, wearing a simple navy blue dress, hair pulled back, hands folded in her lap. She didn't look nervous. Not exactly. But there was a tightness in her jaw, a stillness in her shoulders that said she was holding herself together piece by piece. Across the room, the three young men sat with their public defenders. They looked smaller now, no longer swaggering in hoodies and chains, but dressed in stiff button-down shirts that didn't quite fit, eyes darting around like they were waiting for someone to yell, "Gotcha." One kept fiddling with his cuffs. Another stared at the floor like it might swallow him whole. The judge entered, everyone stood, and the trial began. The prosecutor opened with the facts: date, time, location. Then came the security footage from the bodega. Grainy, yes, but clear enough. The video showed the woman walking calmly down the sidewalk, then the three stepping into her path, shoving, slurs, the flash of a blade, and then within seconds the takedown. Efficient, controlled, over. Before most people would have even processed what was happening, the prosecutor paused the video right after she disarmed the knife wielder. "Your Honor, the defense claims this was an unprovoked assault by the victim, but the footage shows she was cornered, threatened with a weapon, and physically attacked before she defended herself." The defense attorneys tried to poke holes. One argued the slurs were taken out of context. Another claimed the knife was never intended to be used. But when the detective took the stand and described the scene, the knife lying open on the pavement, the fresh bruise on her shoulder, the lack of defensive wounds on the attackers, their arguments started to crumble. Then it was her turn to testify. She walked to the witness stand slowly, deliberately, placed her hand on the Bible, swore to tell the truth. Her voice was calm, steady, but not cold. She spoke like someone who'd seen too much to be dramatic, but cared too much to stay silent. She described the walk home. The shift at the hospital. The moment she realized these weren't just kids hanging out, they were hunting. "I didn't want to fight," she said. "I asked them to let me pass. I told them I didn't want trouble. When they pulled the knife, I knew I had seconds to decide, run, submit, or defend. Running could have made it worse. Submitting meant risking my life, so I chose to protect myself, using only what I needed to stop the threat." The defense lawyer cross-examined her, trying to make her sound aggressive. "You trained in combat, correct? You've been taught to neutralize threats quickly." "Yes," she replied. "But I was also taught that the goal isn't to win a fight. It's to go home alive and to leave the other person able to do the same if possible." That line stuck with people. Even the judge glanced up from his notes. Later, a forensic expert testified that the injuries on the three men matched defensive takedowns, joint locks, pressure point strikes, controlled sweeps, not the wild, angry blows you'd expect from someone lashing out in rage. One had a minor sprain, another a bruised nose, the third a scraped elbow. Nothing broken, nothing permanent. Meanwhile, outside the courtroom, the story kept growing. Local news covered the trial daily, not with flashy graphics, but with quiet interviews. A neighbor described how she'd once stayed up all night with an elderly woman whose oxygen tank failed, waiting with her for the ambulance. A nurse from the hospital said she always volunteered for the hardest shifts, especially during holidays. "She never talks about her service," the nurse said. "But you can tell she carries herself like someone who's seen the worst of people and still chooses to help." But not all attention was kind. Online, hate groups doubled down. They dug up old photos, twisted her words, called her a trained killer who enjoyed hurting white kids. One forum post claimed she'd set them up to look like victims. The comments were vile, full of threats and lies. She didn't read most of it. But sometimes late at night she'd scroll just enough to understand the noise. And each time she'd close her phone and remind herself, "Their fear isn't my failure." What surprised her more were the messages from strangers who did believe her. A veteran wrote, "You represented us with honor, not with fists but with restraint." A teenage girl sent a letter. "I'm scared to walk home from school too. Seeing you stand up gives me courage." A retired police officer emailed the prosecutor, "I've seen hundreds of assault cases. This woman didn't just defend herself, she followed protocol better than most officers I've worked with." Those words mattered, not because they erased the pain, but because they reminded her she wasn't alone. Back in court, the final witness was a psychologist who specialized in hate-motivated violence. He explained how racial slurs aren't just words, they're tools of intimidation, designed to strip someone of their dignity and signal that they're not safe. When someone is targeted because of their race, he said, the threat isn't just physical, it's existential. It says, "You don't belong here. You don't deserve to be here." That kind of fear changes how a person reacts and how they're justified in protecting themselves. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. Guilty. On all counts: aggravated assault, possession of a weapon with intent to harm, and most significantly, violation of state hate crime laws. The judge didn't mince words during sentencing. "This wasn't a random scuffle," he said, looking directly at the 3 young men. "This was a targeted attack based on race. You chose hate over humanity, and because of that, you'll face real consequences." They were sentenced to prison, 2 years for the knife wielder, 18 months for the others, plus mandatory anti-bias counseling and community service upon release. It wasn't life in prison, but it was justice, real, measured, legal justice. After the verdict, reporters swarmed her outside the courthouse, microphones thrust forward, cameras clicking. "Do you feel vindicated?" one asked. She shook her head. "Vindication sounds like I wanted to prove something. I just wanted to tell the truth." "Will you speak out more now?" another asked. "I'll keep doing what I've always done," she said. "Helping people, teaching, healing. But maybe now I'll also help others learn how to protect themselves without losing their peace." She didn't give a long speech. Didn't pose for photos. Just walked away, head high, shoulders relaxed for the first time in weeks. That evening, she went back to the community center where she'd agreed to teach self-defense classes. The room was empty except for a few folding chairs and a worn-out mat rolled up in the corner. She unrolled it slowly, smoothing out the creases with her hands. She thought about the boys in court, how young they were, how lost. Not excuses, but facts. Hate isn't born, it's taught. And if it can be taught, maybe it can be untaught too. Her class wouldn't just be about blocking punches or escaping grabs. It would be about awareness, how to read a situation before it turns dangerous, how to use your voice as your first line of defense, how to call for help without shame, and most importantly, how to walk through the world without fear dictating your every step. She sat on the edge of the mat, staring at the blank wall. No trophies, no headlines, just a quiet room and a purpose. The real victory wasn't the verdict. It was this, the choice to keep showing up, to keep teaching, to keep believing that safety shouldn't be a privilege, it should be a right. And as the sun dipped below the rooftops, casting golden light through the dusty windows, she knew she was exactly where she needed to be, not as a symbol, not as a soldier, but as a human being who refused to let hate have the last word. Because sometimes, the strongest thing you can do after surviving an attack isn't to strike back harder, it's to build something better in its place. Life didn't magically get easier after the trial ended. Justice had been served, yes, but healing? That was a quieter, slower thing. It didn't come with gavels or headlines. It came in small moments, a deep breath before stepping outside, the way her hands no longer tensed at the sound of footsteps behind her, the first time she walked past that alley without flinching. She kept working at the hospital, still stitching up wounds and calming panicked families in the ER. But now something had shifted. People looked at her differently, not with pity, not with awe, but with a kind of quiet respect. Nurses would nod when she entered a room. Security guards gave her a little extra space, not out of fear, but because they understood what she'd been through. Even the janitor, a man who rarely spoke to anyone, once handed her a cup of coffee and said, "You did good, ma'am." But the real change was inside her. Before the attack, she'd kept her past locked away, her service, her training, the things she'd seen and done. She thought that part of her life was over, something to be folded up and stored like old uniforms in a closet. But the trial, the questions, the need to explain why she moved the way she did, it forced her to reconnect with that part of herself. Not as a weapon, but as wisdom. And that's how the self-defense classes began. Not with a grand announcement or a press conference. Just a flyer taped to the community center bulletin board. Free safety and awareness workshop for women. Learn to trust your instincts. Taught by a veteran, no photos. No promises of becoming a fighter, just a time, a place, and an open door. The first night, only 6 women showed up. They sat on folding chairs in a circle, eyes cautious, arms crossed. Some looked barely out of high school. Others had gray in their hair and lines of worry around their eyes. One clutched a tote bag like it was a shield. She didn't start with punches or kicks. She started with questions. "What makes you feel unsafe?" she asked gently. Silence at first. Then slowly, voices rose. The bus stop after dark. Walking to my car in the parking lot. My neighbor who watches me too closely. Even my own family sometimes when they say I'm overreacting, she listened. Really listened. No judgment. No quick fixes. Just presence. Then she said, "Your fear isn't weakness. It's your body trying to protect you. The problem isn't that you feel afraid. It's that no one ever taught you what to do with it." That night, they didn't throw a single punch. They practiced standing tall, making eye contact, saying no in a voice that didn't shake. They learned how to scan a room, how to identify exits, how to use everyday objects, a pen, a key, a heavy book, as tools of last resort. Most importantly, they talked about the right to say this doesn't feel right and walk away, no explanation needed. By the 3rd class, the room was full. Women brought friends. Some brought daughters. One brought her elderly mother who said, "At my age, I thought I was too old to learn, but I'd rather try than live scared." She taught them pressure points, not to hurt but to create space. How to break a wrist grab, how to shout in a way that cuts through noise and grabs attention. She showed them how to call 911 calmly, even when their heart was racing. Clarity saves lives, she'd say. Panic hides them. But the most powerful lesson wasn't physical. One evening, a young woman stayed after class, twisting her hands nervously. What if I freeze?" she whispered. "What if I can't move or scream or do any of this?" She looked at her, eyes soft. "Freezing is normal. It's your brain's way of surviving when fight or flight feels impossible. You're not broken. You're human? She told them about her own moments. Times overseas when the world went silent, when her body locked up for a split second before training kicked in. Survival looks different for everyone, she said. Sometimes it's running. Sometimes it's fighting. Sometimes it's playing dead until help comes. All of it counts, word spread. Not through social media, but through whispers in grocery lines, church pews, bus stops. There's a class. She's real. She doesn't make you feel stupid. Soon, the center had to move the sessions to a bigger room. Local organizations took notice. A women's shelter asked if she'd come teach their residents. A high school counselor wanted a version for teenage girls. Even the city's Violence Prevention Task Force reached out, asking if she'd help design a public safety program. She said yes, but with conditions. No cameras. No recordings. No turning real pain into performance. This wasn't entertainment. It was healing. Around the same time, something unexpected happened. One of the attackers, the one who'd held the knife, wrote her a letter from jail. It wasn't an apology, not exactly, but it was honest. He wrote about growing up in a home full of hate, how older cousins fed him lies about people who looked like her, how he thought acting tough would earn him respect. I didn't see you as a person, he wrote. Just a target. But watching the trial, hearing you talk, I realized I was the one who was weak. Hate made me stupid. He didn't ask for forgiveness, just said he was taking the anti-bias classes seriously, that he'd started reading real history, not the twisted version he'd been fed. Maybe it's too late, he wrote, but I don't want to be that person anymore. She read the letter 3 times. Then she folded it and put it in a drawer. Not to forget, but to remember people can change. Not all do, but some try. She never wrote back. But she did mention his words, carefully, anonymously, in a talk she gave at a youth center. Hate is learned, she told a room full of teenagers. But so is courage. So is kindness. You get to choose which one you pass on. Meanwhile, her own life settled into a new rhythm. Mornings at the hospital. Evenings at the community center. Weekends spent planning curriculum or meeting with counselors to make sure her classes addressed trauma, not just tactics. She still had hard days. Days when a certain tone of voice made her stomach drop. Days when she double-checked her locks 3 times. But now she had tools, not just for defense but for peace. One rainy afternoon, as she packed up mats after class, a woman she'd never seen before approached her. She looked tired, eyes red-rimmed, holding a crumpled tissue. I came today because last week someone followed me home, she said quietly. I didn't fight. I didn't scream. I just ran. And I've been ashamed ever since. She put a hand on the woman's arm. You got away. That's what matters. You listened to your gut. That's strength. The woman's eyes filled with tears. No one's ever told me that before. That night, as she walked home under a sky clearing after the rain, she thought about all the women who'd walked through that classroom door carrying invisible weights. Fear, shame, silence. And how, one by one, they were learning to set those weights down. Not because the world had become safe, but because they were no longer facing it alone. She passed the alley where it all began. The bricks were the same. The streetlight still flickered. But this time she didn't look away. She stopped for just a second, not in fear, but in quiet acknowledgement. This place tried to break me, she thought, but it didn't. Instead, it reminded her of something she already knew. Deep down, safety isn't just about locks and alarms and knowing how to throw a punch. It's about community, about trust, about knowing someone's got your back, even if they've never met you. And as she turned the corner toward home, shoulders relaxed, breath steady, she smiled. Not because the fight was over, but because she'd found a better way to keep going. Not with anger, not with fear, but with purpose. And that, more than anything, was true strength. 6 months had passed since that night in the alley. Spring had arrived in Norfolk. Soft breezes, dogwoods blooming, the harbor alive with boats and seagulls. The city felt lighter, as if it had exhaled after holding its breath too long. And in a small gym tucked behind a library and a laundromat, something quiet but powerful was growing. The space wasn't fancy. Faded blue mats covered the floor. A whiteboard leaned against the wall with phrases like, "Trust your gut," and "Your voice is your first weapon," written in neat letters. Folding chairs lined the edges, and a water cooler sat in the corner with paper cups stacked beside it. But every Tuesday and Thursday evening, this room filled with women. Some young, some old. some with kids waiting in the hallway, some coming straight from second-shift jobs. They came not for glory, not for revenge, but for something far more precious: peace of mind. She stood near the front, not on a stage, not elevated, just among them. No uniform, no medals, no title on her chest. Just jeans, a plain t-shirt, and the calm presence of someone who'd walked through fire and come out the other side with her humanity intact. Tonight's class wasn't about strikes or escapes. It was about boundaries. "Raise your hand if you've ever said yes when you meant no," she asked. Almost every hand went up. She nodded. That's not weakness. That's survival in a world that teaches women to be polite, even when it costs them. She paused. But your safety matters more than someone else's comfort. They practiced saying no in different tones: firm, calm, loud. They role-played walking away from pushy strangers, ending uncomfortable conversations, even setting limits with family. One woman who'd been coming for weeks but never spoken much finally whispered, "I told my cousin to stop joking about my body last week. He got mad, but I didn't back down." The room filled with quiet murmurs of support. No applause, just nods, smiles, the kind of understanding that doesn't need words. After class, as she rolled up the mats, a teenager lingered by the door. She couldn't have been more than 16, wearing a hoodie 2 sizes too big and eyes that had seen too much too soon. "Can I ask you something?" the girl said. "Of course, people online, they call you a hero, but you don't talk like one." She smiled gently. "Because I'm not. Heroes are in movies. I'm just someone who got tired of pretending the world is fair when it's not." "But you fought back," the girl said, voice low, "and you didn't become like them." "That's the real fight," she replied. "Not the one in the alley. The one after. Choosing not to let hate change who you are. That's harder. And more important." The girl nodded slowly, like she was filing that away for later. Then she turned and walked out into the warm evening, shoulders a little straighter. Later that week, the city council invited her to speak at a public safety meeting. Not as a victim, not as a symbol, but as an advisor. They were launching a new initiative: community-led safety patrols, trauma-informed training for police, and expanded self-defense programs in schools and shelters. And they wanted her help designing it. She agreed, but only if survivors had a seat at the table. Only if the focus stayed on prevention, not punishment. Only if the message was clear: safety isn't just the absence of violence. It's the presence of dignity. She didn't give a speech that day. She told a story about walking home, about fear, about the moment she realized her greatest weapon wasn't her training, but her choice to remain kind even when the world wasn't. Afterward, an older man in a veteran's cap approached her. "My daughter's in one of your classes," he said, voice thick. "She used to jump at every sound. Now she walks like she owns the sidewalk." "Thank you." She just touched his arm. "Thank her." She did the hard part. Back at the gym a few days later, she watched as a group of women practiced walking with confidence. Shoulders back, gaze steady, pace unhurried. One woman, who'd once whispered her answers, now called out directions during drills. Another, who'd cried during her first class, now helped newcomers tie their practice belts. This wasn't about creating fighters. It was about restoring power, to move freely, to speak clearly, to exist without apology. Sometimes former students would stop her in the grocery store or at the bus stop. Not to gawk, but to share small victories. "I yelled at a man who followed me, right, in the middle of the mall. I taught my daughter how to call 911. I finally reported my landlord after he kept accidentally walking into my apartment." Each story was a thread in a larger tapestry, one of resilience, yes, but also of connection. She still worked at the hospital, still patched up wounds and held hands during bad news. But now, when a young woman came in with bruises and downcast eyes, she didn't just treat the injury. She'd quietly slip her a card with the class schedule. No pressure, just an open door. And sometimes, weeks later, that same woman would show up at the gym, nervous, hesitant, but there. That was enough. One evening, as she locked up the gym, she found a small envelope taped to the door. Inside was a drawing, a stick figure woman standing tall, surrounded by other stick figures holding hands. At the bottom, in careful handwriting, "You helped us feel safe in our own skin." She pinned it to the whiteboard the next day. The media still called occasionally. "Would you do an interview? Can we do a feature?" She always said no. Not out of pride, but because the work spoke for itself. Real change didn't happen under bright lights. It happened in dimly lit gyms, in whispered conversations, in the quiet courage of ordinary people choosing to stand up for themselves and each other.